Imagine this. A pregnant woman, 7 months along, walks into a hospital and walks out in an ambulance because her own sister-in-law and her husband's mistress kicked her to the ground. Everyone thought she was married to an ordinary man from an ordinary family. But what they didn't know was that her father wasn't ordinary at all. He wasn't just a retired firefighter. He was a billionaire in disguise. And when he heard his daughter scream over the phone, he didn't call his lawyer. He called 911 and then started a ruthless revenge that would destroy everyone who hurt her. Stay till the end. Trust me, you'll want to see how justice is served. And hey, if stories like this make your heart race, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital hummed above Sarah Mitchell, Hartford, as she sat in the fourth-floor waiting area, one hand resting protectively on her 7.5-month pregnant belly. At 29 years old, she had the kind face of someone who still believed the best in people, even when they showed her otherwise. Her phone buzzed, another Instagram notification. She opened the app without thinking, scrolling past advertisements and food photos until she stopped cold. Chelsea Price's latest post glowed on the screen, a luxury hotel pool in London. The caption read, "London vibes," with a sparkle emoji. Sarah recognized that hotel immediately. Marcus had told her he was staying there for business, but it was the comments that made her stomach drop. "Oh my God, who's the hot guy in the background?" someone had written. Sarah zoomed in with trembling fingers. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Marcus, her husband, by the pool, with Chelsea. "Mrs. Hartford," a nurse called from the reception desk. Grace Murphy, a kind woman in her mid-30s with tired eyes, smiled warmly. "Dr. Garcia will see you in about 15 minutes. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Her throat had closed up. She stared at the photo again, trying to find an innocent explanation. But her mind kept circling back to the same horrible truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Two women stepped out, and the energy in the waiting room shifted immediately. They moved like they owned not just the floor, but the entire building, which Sarah realized with a sinking feeling the Hartford family practically did. They were major donors. Vanessa Hartford emerged first, 37 years old and dressed in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the tile with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Behind her followed Chelsea Price, wearing designer casual clothes that looked effortlessly expensive. Sarah's heart began to race. This couldn't be a coincidence. Vanessa's eyes locked onto Sarah, and something cold and calculating passed across her face. She whispered something to Chelsea, then they both walked directly toward her. "Sarah," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the waiting area. "Fancy seeing you here." Sarah stood up slowly, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Vanessa, Chelsea, what are you doing here?" "Oh, we were just visiting a friend," Chelsea said with fake sweetness dripping from every word. "What a coincidence." "Walk with me, Sarah," Vanessa commanded, not asked. "We need to discuss something." Every instinct told Sarah to refuse, to stay in the public area where nurses and other patients could see. But she had been raised to be polite, to avoid confrontation, so she followed. Vanessa led her down a hallway near the restrooms, away from the crowd. Sarah noticed a security camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. "I'll be direct," Vanessa said, turning to face her. "My family has standards. You don't meet them." Sarah blinked. "Excuse me?" Chelsea stepped closer, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. "She means Marcus deserves someone from his world. Not a charity case." "I love Marcus," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "And he loves me." Vanessa laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Love? How middle class. Let me tell you about Marcus. He's weak, easily manipulated. The only reason you're pregnant is because I allowed it. For a time." "What are you talking about?" "Chelsea, show her." Chelsea pulled out her phone with a satisfied smirk. She scrolled through her photo gallery and turned the screen towards Sarah. The images hit like physical blows. Marcus and Chelsea at an intimate dinner, hands touching across the table. Marcus and Chelsea in a hotel room, his shirt unbuttoned, her laughing. Marcus and Chelsea kissing in an elevator. Sarah's world tilted. Her hand went to her stomach, feeling the baby kick as if sensing her distress. "No," she whispered. "Marcus wouldn't," Chelsea interrupted. "Honey, he's been with me for 3 months. Your whole pregnancy." Vanessa stepped closer, invading Sarah's space. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave my brother. Quietly. I'll give you $500,000 to disappear. Or, or what?" Vanessa's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Or I'll make sure you lose everything. Your reputation, your career, your precious little baby." Sarah tried to step back, but she was already against the wall. "You can't threaten me. I'll tell Marcus." "Tell him what?" Chelsea laughed. "That his sister was mean? He'll choose us. He always does." Sarah tried to walk past them, but Vanessa grabbed her arm and spun her around violently. "I'm not finished," Vanessa hissed. "Let go of me." Sarah pulled away, and that's when everything happened at once. Vanessa's anger exploded. "You don't walk away from me!" Chelsea shoved Sarah hard toward the wall. Sarah stumbled, her pregnant belly throwing off her balance. She tried to catch herself, but her feet slipped on the polished floor. Then came the kick. Vanessa's Louboutin heel struck Sarah's ankle with deliberate force. The pain was immediate and shocking. Sarah's legs gave out, and she crashed to the floor. She tried to protect her stomach, but momentum carried her forward. She landed hard on her side. There was a moment of terrible silence. Then Sarah screamed. Blood began pooling beneath her, spreading across the white tile in a crimson stain that seemed to grow impossibly fast. Grace Murphy rounded the corner at a run, her medical training taking over before her mind could fully process what she was seeing. "Oh my God, what happened?" Vanessa's face transformed instantly, her expression shifting from rage to composed innocence. "She slipped. So clumsy." "Yeah, we tried to catch her," Chelsea added quickly. Grace dropped to her knees beside Sarah, already pulling out her phone to call for help. "Don't move, honey. I'm calling for a doctor right now." Vanessa and Chelsea exchanged a glance. Some unspoken understanding passed between them. "We were never here," Vanessa whispered to Chelsea. "Understand?" They turned to leave, their heels clicking against the tile in perfect rhythm. The elevator doors opened. Frank Mitchell stepped out, and the world seemed to slow down. He was 62 years old, dressed in a flannel shirt and worn jeans, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades fighting fires in Brooklyn. He'd come to surprise his daughter at her appointment. Instead, he saw her lying in a pool of blood. His eyes took in the scene in one sweeping glance. His daughter. The blood. Two well-dressed women walking away with guilty haste written in every movement. Frank's face went through a transformation. Shock melted into realization, then hardened into something cold and terrible. He ran to Sarah, dropping to his knees beside Grace. "Sarah, baby girl, stay with me." "Dad," Sarah sobbed. "The baby. I can't feel the baby moving." Grace was already applying pressure to slow the bleeding, shouting for additional help. "We need to get her to the operating room now. Possible placental abruption." Frank looked up at Vanessa, who had stopped walking. Their eyes met across the corridor. "What did you do to my daughter?" His voice was deadly calm. Vanessa lifted her chin. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "She fell. These floors are very slippery." "You're lying." "Prove it," Vanessa said, gesturing to Chelsea. "My friend here witnessed the same thing. Terrible accident." Frank pulled out his phone with trembling hands. He dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" "Fourth floor, Mercy General Hospital. My daughter's been assaulted. She's 7 months pregnant. She's bleeding. We need police and ambulance immediately." "Sir, you said assault. 2 women attacked her. They're still here. Send someone now." Vanessa's confidence flickered for just a moment. "You're making a mistake," she said. Frank kept his eyes locked on hers as he spoke into the phone. "I'm looking at one of them right now. Tall, brunette, expensive designer suit. Tell the officers to look for someone who thinks she's above the law." EMTs burst through the stairwell doors, rushing forward with a stretcher. Behind them came a police detective, badge already visible on her belt. As they loaded Sarah onto the stretcher, Frank followed close behind. But before he entered the elevator, He looked back one final time at Vanessa Hartford. What she saw in his eyes made her uncomfortable for the first time in her carefully controlled life. It wasn't rage, it was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. The ambulance siren wailed as it raced through Manhattan traffic. Inside, Sarah gripped her father's hand while monitors beeped frantically around them. "Dad, I'm scared," she whispered. "You're going to be okay. Both of you, I promise." But as Frank held his daughter's hand, a single thought echoed through his mind with crystal clarity. Nobody hurts my little girl. Nobody. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a modest apartment filled with thrift store furniture, a wall safe sat hidden behind a framed photograph. Inside that safe were documents that would change everything. Legal papers for Mitchell Properties, LLC, stock certificates worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Evidence of a secret that Frank Mitchell had kept for 12 long years. The Hartfords had just made the worst mistake of their lives. They thought they were kicking a poor man's daughter. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you destroy a Titan's only child. 3 hours later, Frank paced outside the surgical ward, still wearing his flannel shirt and jeans. His hands were stained with his daughter's blood. He hadn't left to wash them. He needed to remember this moment, to carry it with him through everything that came next. Detective Samantha Reeves approached with a notepad in her hand. She was 44 years old with the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of humanity's dark side. 22 years with the New York Police Department, mostly in the Special Victims Unit. She knew how the wealthy operated, how they weaponized their money and lawyers. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, "I'm Detective Reeves. Can we talk?" Frank looked up. "Is my daughter still in surgery? The doctor said she's stable, but they're monitoring the baby closely. It's going to be a while." Frank exhaled and sat heavily in one of the plastic chairs. His whole body seemed to sag. "I need your statement about what you saw," Detective Reeves continued. Frank took a moment to compose himself. "I came out of the elevator. My daughter was on the ground bleeding. Those two women were walking away." "You didn't see the actual assault?" "No, but the nurse did. Grace Murphy. She saw everything." Detective Reeves made a note. "Oui, Shisti. We'll talk to her. Did the two women say anything?" "The tall one, Vanessa, said Sarah fell. But I know my daughter. She wouldn't just fall." "Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, do you know who these women are?" "Vanessa Hartford. My daughter married her brother 6 months ago." Detective Reeves paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "The Hartford family, as in Hartford Capital Management?" "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly, and Frank could see her mental calculation playing out. A case against one of the wealthiest families in New York. The lawyers, the pressure, the uphill battle. "Sir, you should know they have very expensive lawyers. This won't be easy." Frank met her eyes with an intensity that made her pause. "Neither am I." There was something in his tone, some hidden weight behind those three words, that made Detective Reeves look at him differently. She had learned to trust her instincts over 2 decades of police work, and her instincts were telling her that Frank Mitchell was more than he appeared. "I'll do everything I can," she said. While Frank gave his statement, Detective Reeves made her way to the hospital security office. Dr. Alan Porter, the chief administrator, was already there. He was 52 years old with thinning hair and nervous hands that couldn't stay still. "I need the security footage from the 4th floor today, 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon," Detective Reeves said. "Of course, Detective," Porter typed rapidly on his computer, then frowned. "That's odd. The file seems to be corrupted." "Corrupted," Detective Reeves repeated flatly. "How convenient. I assure you this is highly unusual. The Hartford family are major donors to this hospital, aren't they?" Porter stiffened. "I don't appreciate what you're insinuating." "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm stating facts. I want that footage recovered today." "I'll see what our IT department can do." As Detective Reeves left, Porter waited exactly 30 seconds before pulling out his personal cell phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed. "Miss Hartford, we have a situation." In the recovery room, Sarah lay connected to monitors, her face pale but her eyes open. Dr. Garcia, a kind obstetrician in her 40s, stood beside the bed reviewing charts. "The surgery went well. We stopped the bleeding. Your baby boy is strong. His heartbeat is good." Sarah started crying with relief. He's okay? For now, but you need complete bed rest. No stress. The next 48 hours are critical. Frank squeezed his daughter's hand. Then the door opened and Marcus Hartford entered. He looked haggard, still wearing his airport clothes. His tie was loose, his hair messy, but there was something performative about his distress, like an actor who had studied the right expressions but couldn't quite capture genuine emotion. Sarah, I came as soon as I landed. Frank stood up immediately, positioning himself between Marcus and the bed. Where were you? London. Business trip. What happened? Your sister happened, Sarah said, her voice breaking. And your girlfriend. Marcus looked genuinely confused. What? Chelsea's not my girlfriend. Don't lie to me. I saw the pictures. What pictures? Sarah, I don't understand. Get out, Frank said quietly. Mr. Mitchell, please, I need to understand. Frank's voice dropped to something dangerous. Your family just tried to kill my grandson. You have 3 seconds to leave before I make you leave. Marcus looked at Sarah one more time. She turned her face away, unable to look at him. Sarah, please. Go! The single word held more finality than any speech. Marcus left, and in the hallway he immediately pulled out his phone. Vanessa, what the hell did you do? Across town in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Vanessa Hartford sat with a glass of wine. Her lawyer, Richard Thorne, a silver-haired man with shark-like eyes, reviewed documents on his tablet. I did what needed to be done, Vanessa said into the phone. She's not good for the family. She's pregnant. She could have died. Stop being dramatic. She fell. It was an accident. That's not what Dad's going to think when he finds out. Dad doesn't need to know. He's already fragile. The last thing he needs is scandal. Richard Thorne leaned forward. Marcus, your sister is right. The best thing you can do is distance yourself from this situation. Who the hell is that? My attorney. Our attorney now. He's handling it. Handling what? Making sure this doesn't destroy everything of Father Biddle. Now, are you with me or against me? There was a long pause. Marcus could feel the weight of choice pressing down on him. His sister, who had controlled him his entire life, or his wife, who represented everything he had wanted but been too weak to protect. I need to think, he said finally. Think fast. Sarah's father filed police charges. We need to present a united front. She hung up before Marcus could respond. Back at the hospital, Frank waited until Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep before he stepped into the hallway. He pulled out his phone and dialed a private number he hadn't used in months. Hal, it's time. Harold Morrison's voice came through the line, smooth and measured. Protocol Omega? Not yet, but soon. I need you to have the team ready. Frank, what happened? They came after Sarah at the hospital. She's 7 months pregnant, and they kicked her. Frank's voice cracked slightly. They kicked her, Hal. There was a moment of silence. Then Harold Morrison's voice came back, all warmth gone, replaced by something cold and professional. I'll activate the team. But Frank, Sarah doesn't know who you really are. When she finds out, I'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, I need you to keep digging into the Hartford family. Everything. I want to know where every dollar came from, where every body is buried, every secret they've ever tried to hide. Consider it done. Frank hung up and walked back toward Sarah's room. He passed a window that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, Vanessa Hartford was celebrating her perceived victory. She thought she'd scared off a nobody, a poor firefighter's daughter who would quietly disappear. She had no idea what was coming. Because Frank Mitchell had spent 12 years living a lie. 12 years pretending to be someone he wasn't. 12 years watching and waiting and hoping he'd never need to become who he truly was again. Those 12 years were over. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Frank sat at his modest kitchen table in Brooklyn, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the entire night at the hospital watching Sarah sleep, memorizing every monitor beep that told him his grandson was still alive. His phone rang. Detective Reeves. Mr. Mitchell, we have a problem. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of problem? The hospital security footage. It's gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? The IT department claims there was a server malfunction. The entire day's footage from that floor was wiped. Frank's voice remained eerily calm. That's impossible. Digital backups exist. They're saying the backup failed too. Very convenient timing. What about the nurse? Grace Murphy? Detective Reeves sighed. I tried to interview her this morning. She's suddenly unavailable for comment. Hospital put her on administrative leave. They're covering it up. I know, but without footage and without a witness, it's your daughter's word against two women who will have very good lawyers. She paused. I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I'm going to keep trying, but I need you to understand what we're up against. What if I told you the footage still exists? Do you have it? Not yet, but I will. Mr. Mitchell, I don't know what you're planning, but thank you for the call, Detective. Frank hung up and immediately dialed another number. This one went through 3 encrypted relays before connecting. Hal, it's time. Protocol Omega? Protocol Omega. I want everything. Hartford financials, family secrets, business deals, mistresses, tax fraud, parking tickets, everything. Harold Morrison's voice took on a note of caution. Frank, if we do this, there's no going back. The moment we start pulling threads, they'll know someone's coming after them. They came after my daughter, my grandson. There is no going back. I'll activate the team. Give me 72 hours. Frank walked to his bedroom and opened the closet. He moved aside winter coats and old shoes until he reached the back wall. His fingers found the hidden latch and a section of the wall swung open to reveal a wall safe. He entered the combination from memory. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were documents that represented a life he'd left behind. Articles of incorporation for Mitchell Properties LLC, stock certificates, real estate deeds, a passport with stamps from business trips to Tokyo, London, Dubai, bank statements showing a net worth of $1.4 billion, and a photograph. Frank in a Tom Ford suit, shaking hands with the mayor of New York at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. That had been 14 years ago, back when everyone knew his name. Back when he was one of the most successful real estate developers in America. Back before Rebecca got sick. Frank closed his eyes, remembering. His wife had been everything to him. Smart, beautiful, compassionate. But when she got cancer, the best doctors in New York had treated her like just another patient. They'd been too busy with their wealthy clients, too distracted by their golf games and charity galas. By the time they'd realized how serious her condition was, it was too late. Rebecca had made him promise in those final days. Promise to raise Sarah away from that world. Promise to let her grow up normal, without the corruption of wealth and power. Promise to let her become who she truly was, not who money would make her. So Frank had sold his company, put his fortune in trusts and shell corporations, and disappeared. He'd bought a modest apartment in Brooklyn and become just another retired firefighter living on a pension. He'd raised Sarah to believe that hard work and compassion mattered more than wealth and status. And it had worked. Sarah had become a pediatric nurse. She'd devoted her life to helping children. She'd met Marcus at a charity gala where she was volunteering, not attending as a donor. Frank had watched Marcus carefully. He'd hoped desperately that the young man would be different from his family, that he would love Sarah for who she was, not for what she could give him. He'd been wrong. Now, standing in front of that open safe, Frank Mitchell made a choice. He'd kept his promise to Rebecca for 12 years. He'd raised Sarah to be strong and compassionate and real. But his wife had also taught him something else. She taught him that sometimes love meant protection, and protection sometimes meant war. Frank pulled out his phone and made one more call. Hal, I need you to start the hospital acquisition immediately. I want to own Mercy General by the end of the week. The parent company is valued at $400 million. Offer them $450 million. Cash, close it by Friday. There was a pause. You're really doing this? I should have done it 12 years ago. 3 days later, Sarah was released from the hospital. Frank had converted his spare bedroom into a recovery space, installing a hospital-grade bed and monitoring equipment. Grace Murphy, who'd been placed on administrative leave, came by twice a day to check on Sarah and the baby. Sarah sat on the couch, her hand resting on her belly, when there was a knock at the door. A man in an expensive suit stood in the hallway. He was in his 40s with a disarming smile and confident posture. Mrs. Hartford, I'm Thomas Blake, attorney. Sarah frowned. I didn't call a lawyer. I know, I'm here pro bono. I heard about your case and I specialize in assault against pregnant women. Why would you do that for free? Because I believe in justice and because women like you shouldn't have to face billion-dollar legal teams alone. Frank appeared behind Sarah, his eyes immediately suspicious. Who are you? Thomas Blake, attorney at law. I'm offering to represent Sarah. Sarah doesn't need, Dad, maybe I should listen to what he has to say. Blake presented credentials, Bar Association membership, case history, references. Everything looked legitimate. What would you need from me? Sarah asked. Just your signature on representation papers. I'll handle everything else. Frank pulled Sarah aside in the hallway. Something's not right about this guy. Dad, we need help. The police said the footage is gone. Without a lawyer, I can get you a lawyer, a real one. With what money? Dad, you're living on a firefighter's pension. Frank hesitated. For a moment, he almost told her everything, but Sarah continued before he could speak. Please, I know you want to protect me, but I'm not a little girl anymore. I need to make my own decisions. Those words hit Frank harder than any punch. She was right. He'd raised her to be independent, to make her own choices. How could he take that away now? They returned to the living room. Sarah signed the papers. Blake smiled, thanked them both, and left. What none of them knew was that across the street, in a black sedan with tinted windows, Vanessa Hartford and Richard Thorne watched the entire exchange. She signed? Thorne asked. Vanessa smiled. Phase 2 begins tonight. 1 week later, Detective Reeves knocked on Frank's door. Her face told him everything before she said a word. Sarah, I'm sorry. I tried to stop this. Stop what? Sarah asked from the couch. The DA isn't pressing charges against Vanessa Hartford or Chelsea Price. Frank's voice rose. What? Why? Insufficient evidence. No footage. Witness recanted. Grace recanted? She saw everything. Hospital threatened her job. She has 3 kids. I'm sorry. Sarah started crying. Frank wanted to rage, to break something, but he forced himself to stay calm. What else, bro? Detective Reeves handed over documents. Your lawyer, Thomas Blake, he filed paperwork on your behalf. What paperwork? An affidavit stating that you're dropping all allegations and admitting you were emotionally unstable due to pregnancy hormones. Sarah grabbed the papers. There was her signature, clear as day, but the words above it were not what she'd agreed to sign. I never agreed to this. I know, but legally it's binding, and it gets worse. Thomas Blake doesn't exist. The Bar Association has no record of him. The credentials were fake, everything. The room spun. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Hello, Sarah. Vanessa's voice was smooth as silk. I trust you've received the news. You did this, Sarah whispered. I gave you a chance to leave quietly. You refused, so I had to get creative. The signature, I didn't know. But you did sign it. Your lawyer will confirm that in court. Oh, wait, you don't have a lawyer anymore. I'll fight this. With what? You're broke. Your father's broke. Meanwhile, I have the best legal team money can buy. How do you think this ends? The line went dead. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. Frank knelt beside her, holding her, while his mind worked through calculations and strategies. Then he stood up and walked to his bedroom. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Hal, buy Mercy General Hospital. I don't care what it costs. The parent company is valued at $400 million. Then offer them $450 million. Cash. Close it by Friday. You're really doing this. I should have done it 12 years ago. But before Hal could respond, his tone changed. Frank, we have a problem. Hartford Capital just purchased 40% of the parent company. They're blocking the sale. Frank closed his eyes. Vanessa had figured out someone was coming after her. She was fortifying her position. Then we go to war, Frank said quietly. And in that moment, the man who had been Frank Mitchell, retired firefighter, began to fade away. In his place emerged someone else, someone harder, Someone who knew how to fight battles with weapons that cut deeper than fists. Someone who had built an empire once before, and who would burn another empire to the ground to protect his daughter. 3 days later, just before dawn, someone pounded on Frank's apartment door. Frank, who hadn't slept more than a few hours since the hospital incident, was already awake. He opened the door to find 4 NYPD officers and a detective with a warrant. Sarah Mitchell Hartford. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, her pregnant belly visible beneath her robe. Yes? You're under arrest for filing a false police report in criminal fraud. No, this is wrong. Frank stepped between them. You can't arrest her. She's 8 months pregnant. Sir, step back or you'll be arrested too. They handcuffed Sarah as gently as they could, but handcuffs are never gentle. Sarah looked at her father with terror in her eyes. Dad, I'll fix this. I promise. I'll fix everything. As they led her away, Frank's phone rang. Hal, Frank, the hospital acquisition. There's been another problem. What now? Hartford Capital just purchased an additional 30%. They now control the company. They're blocking everything. Frank felt something snap inside him. Not his temper. Something colder. Something that had been dormant for 12 years, finally breaking free. Hal, I want you to activate Protocol Omega. Full deployment. There was a pause. Frank, I know what it is. Do it. At the police precinct, Sarah sat in a holding cell. Her hands rested protectively on her belly, while tears streamed down her face. How had everything gone so wrong? 2 weeks ago, she'd been a pediatric nurse planning for her baby's arrival. Now she was in jail, facing 5 years in prison for crimes she didn't commit. A tired-looking woman in a rumpled suit approached the cell. Mrs. Hartford, I'm Janet Ross, your court-appointed attorney. I know I can't afford a lawyer. Here's the situation. The DA has a signed affidavit with your signature. You're facing up to 5 years. Best I can do is a plea deal. Plead guilty, you get probation. But I didn't know what I was signing. Doesn't matter. Legally, it's binding. Sarah wanted to scream. Instead, she just said, I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Then you're looking at trial, which you will lose. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the booking area. Detective Reeves was practically running toward the desk sergeant. Where is she? Sarah Mitchell. Detective, you can't just... There's been a development. Detective Reeves reached Sarah's cell, slightly out of breath. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. Everything's about to change. What are you talking about? Your father, he's not who you think he is. 10 minutes later, Sarah sat in a conference room, still in handcuffs. Captain James Rodriguez, Detective Reeves, and Assistant District Attorney Monica Carter faced her across the table. Mrs. Hartford, we've received a call from the New York Attorney General's office. Sarah's mind couldn't process what was happening. I don't understand. Your father, Frank Mitchell, did you know he owns Mitchell Properties, LLC? What? No. My dad's a retired firefighter. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. Ma'am, Mitchell Properties is one of the largest commercial real estate firms in Texas. Net worth, $1.4 billion. The words didn't make sense. They were English, but they weren't connecting to anything real in Sarah's mind. That's impossible. My dad lives in Brooklyn, in a tiny apartment. Detective Reeves spoke gently. A tiny apartment he purchased in cash 12 years ago, under an LLC. Ms. Mitchell, your father has been, well, undercover, for lack of a better word. An hour ago, ADA Carter continued, Mr. Mitchell's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss all charges against you. They've also delivered evidence that the hospital footage still exists. Oh, how? Because as of 6 o'clock this morning, your father owns Mercy General Hospital. All of it. The door opened. Harold Morrison entered first, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Sarah's car. Behind him came a man Sarah didn't recognize at first. He wore a Tom Ford suit that fit perfectly. A Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist. His posture radiated command and authority. Then he spoke, and Sarah knew. Hey, baby girl, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. It was her father's voice, but it came from someone else. Someone who looked like her father but carried himself like he owned the world, which apparently he did. Dad? Harold Morrison set his briefcase on the table. Captain, you'll find everything you need here. Full security footage from Mercy General, time-stamped and authenticated. Sworn affidavit from Nurse Grace Murphy, who is now under protection of official security. And evidence that Thomas Blake was paid $250,000 by Hartford Capital to defraud my client. Captain Rodriguez reviewed the papers, his expression growing more serious with each page. This changes everything. It does, Harold agreed. My client was a victim of conspiracy and fraud. I expect charges dropped immediately. 88 Carter turned to Detective Reeves. Get her out of cuffs, now! The handcuffs came off. Sarah stood shakily, her mind still trying to catch up to reality. Why didn't you tell me? She asked Frank. Because I needed to see who Marcus really was. If I'd shown up as a billionaire, he might have treated you differently. I needed to know the truth. So you've been lying to me my entire adult life? I've been protecting you. By letting me think we were poor? By watching me struggle? Frank's voice softened. You never struggled. I made sure of that. But I also made sure you never became like them. He gestured vaguely toward where the Hartfords would be. You became everything your mother wanted. Strong, compassionate, real. Harold Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps this conversation should continue elsewhere. We have a war to wage. Sarah looked at her father, this stranger who was somehow still her dad. A war? Frank's eyes grew cold. They hurt my daughter. They tried to kill my grandson. Now I'm going to show them what a real billionaire can do when you threaten his family. And in that moment, Sarah understood. Her father hadn't just been protecting her from the wealthy world. He'd been protecting the wealthy world from him. 2 days later, Sarah found herself in Dallas, sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 50th floor of Mitchell Properties headquarters. The building was stunning, all steel and glass, with views that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of place she'd seen in movies, but never imagined she'd actually enter. Now, apparently, her father owned it. Frank sat at the head of a massive conference table. Harold Morrison sat to his right. 12 other people, lawyers and financial analysts, filled the remaining seats. Everyone had tablets and laptops open. Multiple screens on the wall displayed financial data, news feeds, and what looked like family trees. Sarah felt like she'd fallen through a mirror into a different world. Hartford Capital Management, Harold began, his voice smooth and professional. $760 million under management. Vanessa Hartford, CEO. But here's what's interesting. The screen shifted to show a complex web of shell companies and financial connections. 35% of their portfolio is leveraged on high-risk derivatives. They've been cooking the books for 3 years. Sarah leaned forward despite herself. You're saying they're committing fraud? I'm saying they're one bad week from collapse, Harold replied. Frank, with your permission? Frank didn't hesitate. Do it. What followed was the most calculated destruction Sarah had ever witnessed. It unfolded over 5 days, each strike carefully planned and executed with surgical precision. Day 1, Mitchell Properties secretly purchased 40% of Hartford Capital's debt obligations. Then they called in all loans, $300 million due in 30 days. Sarah watched from the war room as phone calls were made, documents were signed, money moved through channels she didn't fully understand. Her father remained calm throughout, giving orders with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Day 2, an anonymous tip went to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It included detailed evidence of Hartford Capital's offshore accounts, the exact transactions that proved insider trading, the names of clients involved in tax evasion schemes. By noon, federal investigators had launched an official probe. By close of business, Hartford Capital's stock had dropped 18%. Dad, Sarah said quietly as they watched the news coverage, this is destroying people's lives. Frank turned to her. These people helped Vanessa cover up your assault. They chose their side. But what about the employees who had nothing to do with it? The secretaries, the assistants? They'll be fine. I've already set up a fund to compensate anyone who loses their job due to Hartford's collapse. But Vanessa Hartford tried to kill my grandson. There are consequences for that. Day 3, major investors started pulling their funds. Sarah watched it happen in real time on the screens. Phone calls, urgent meetings, panicked emails. Hartford Capital was bleeding money. In her penthouse, Vanessa threw a wine glass at her television as the news anchor detailed her company's downfall. "Who's doing this?" she screamed at Richard Thorne. "I don't know," he admitted, "but they're very good. They know exactly where to strike." Day 4, the Wall Street Journal published a front-page article titled Hartford Capital Under Federal Investigation. The story detailed years of questionable practices, suspicious transactions, and client complaints that had been quietly settled. Sarah read the article on her tablet. "Where did they get all this information?" Harold smiled slightly. "We have very good investigators." "You mean you have been digging into their lives?" "We've been uncovering truth," Harold corrected. "There's a difference." Day 5, Marcus Hartford called his sister. Sarah was in the room when Frank played the recording his security team had intercepted. They listened to Marcus's voice, small and defeated. "The board wants you to resign, Vanessa. I built this company, and now it's falling apart. Father's legacy. Don't you dare talk to me about legacy." Meanwhile, at the Hartford family estate, William Hartford Sr. sat in his wheelchair, oxygen tank beside him, watching the news. At 76 years old, with emphysema slowly killing him, he'd turned over the family business to Vanessa years ago. Now he watched everything he'd built crumbling on live television. "My God," he whispered, "what has she done?" Back in Dallas, Sarah stood at the window of the war room, looking out over the city. Her father came to stand beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "A week ago, I thought I knew who you were, who I was. Now everything's different." "You're still you, Sarah. That hasn't changed." "Hasn't it? I'm part of this now." She gestured to the war room behind them. "I'm watching you destroy people. I'm protecting you. By becoming what Mom made you promise not to be." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother made me promise to keep you away from this world. And I did. For 12 years, I kept that promise. But she also taught me something else. She taught me that love means protection, and sometimes protection means fighting. Even if innocent people get hurt, I've set up compensation. No one who doesn't deserve it will suffer." But Vanessa Hartford, Chelsea Price, they made their choice when they kicked you. Sarah put a hand on her belly. The baby was moving, kicking gently as if to remind her why all of this mattered. "What happens next?" she asked. Frank's expression hardened. "Now we move to phase 2. Financial destruction was just the opening move. Now we destroy their reputation, their social standing, everything they value. And then we make sure they go to prison for what they did to you." Sarah should have been horrified. Maybe the old Sarah, the one who'd existed a week ago, would have been. But that Sarah had nearly lost her baby because wealthy people thought they were above consequences. This Sarah was learning that sometimes justice required more than faith in the system. Sometimes it required someone with enough power to make the system work. "Okay," she said quietly. "What do you need me to do?" Frank looked at his daughter with something like pride mixed with sadness. "Just get better. Take care of yourself and my grandson. Let me handle the rest." But as they stood there together, looking out over Dallas, neither of them noticed Harold Morrison in the background, speaking quietly into his phone. "Yes, confirmed. Vanessa Hartford is planning something. She's not going down without a fight. Keep surveillance active. I want to know every move she makes." Because while Frank Mitchell was busy destroying an empire, Vanessa Hartford was plotting her own revenge. She might have lost her company, her fortune, and her reputation, but she still had one card left to play, and that card was about to tear Frank's carefully constructed plan apart. Phase 2 began with information. Harold Morrison's team had compiled dossiers on Hartford Capital's 20 largest clients, wealthy individuals who valued privacy above everything else. Old money, new money, tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, all with secrets. Maria Vega, a financial analyst Frank had worked with for 15 years, presented the findings. She was a sharp woman in her 30s with a gift for finding patterns others missed. "We've identified their inner circle. All of them value discretion. That's why they chose Hartford Capital. Vanessa promised them absolute privacy for their offshore accounts." "What do we have on them?" Frank asked. Maria pulled up a chart. "Everything. Tax evasion, affairs, illegitimate children, embezzlement, securities fraud. One board member has 3 families in different states, none of whom know about the others." Sarah, sitting beside her father, felt uncomfortable. Dad, this feels wrong. Frank turned to her. Does it feel wrong that they helped Vanessa cover up your assault? They might not have known. They knew Hartford Capital was corrupt. They chose to look away because it benefited them. Now they'll face the consequences. Over the next 72 hours, information began leaking to the press. Not through obvious channels, but through careful whispers to investigative journalists, anonymous tips to the IRS, strategic documents left where they'd be found. The first leak hit the hardest. Evidence that Hartford Capital had helped 12 major clients hide over $50 million in offshore accounts. By noon, the IRS had launched audits. By evening, all 12 clients had pulled their remaining funds from Hartford Capital. The second leak targeted a specific board member. Photos appeared in tabloids showing him with his mistress. His wife filed for divorce the same day. He resigned from Hartford Capital to deal with the scandal, and the story spread through Manhattan society like wildfire. The third leak was the one that turned public opinion permanently. Evidence that Vanessa Hartford had bribed Dr. Alan Porter, the hospital administrator, to delete security footage and discredit Sarah. Dr. Porter was arrested at his home. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs made every evening news broadcast, and Vanessa was named as his co-conspirator. Sarah watched the news coverage from the hotel suite Frank had set up in Dallas. She saw Vanessa's face on the screen, the carefully constructed image of the successful female CEO crumbling under the weight of scandal. She looks broken, Sarah said quietly. Good, Frank replied, his voice cold. That night, Vanessa Hartford sat alone in her penthouse. The view of Central Park that had once brought her peace now felt like a mockery. Her phone had stopped ringing. Former friends weren't returning calls. Board members had turned on her. Even Marcus, her weak, pathetic brother, had distanced himself. She poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands. The apartment felt enormous and empty. All her life, she'd built walls of money and power and prestige. Now those walls were collapsing, and she was trapped in the ruins. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity or perhaps desperation made her pick up. Hello, Miss Hartford. We've never formally met. The voice was calm, measured, masculine. It sent a chill down her spine. Who is this? My name is Frank Mitchell. You kicked my daughter. Vanessa's mind raced. Frank Mitchell, Sarah's father, the retired firefighter. But how, You're doing this, she whispered. The SEC, the clients, everything. I'm doing what you should have thought about before you put your hands on a pregnant woman. You can't destroy me. I have resources. Had. Past tense. By tomorrow morning, you'll have nothing. I'll fight you, with what? Your company's bankrupt. Your clients are gone. Your reputation is ashes. And tomorrow, the district attorney is filing criminal charges against you. Vanessa felt her carefully maintained composure finally crack. For what? Assault, bribery, conspiracy, evidence tampering. Should I go on? The line went dead. Vanessa sat in darkness, her wine glass forgotten. She'd spent her entire life believing she was untouchable. That money and power created an invisible shield that protected her from consequences. She'd been wrong. Back in Dallas, Frank ended the call and set his phone down. Harold Morrison looked up from his laptop. That was effective, but you know she's not going to go quietly. I know, which is why we need to move fast on phase 3, the legal reckoning. The DA's office is ready. They have everything they need for criminal charges. But Frank, you should know that Vanessa's been making calls. She's desperate, which makes her dangerous. Frank nodded. Increase security around Sarah. I want someone with her at all times. Already done. What Frank didn't know was that while he was orchestrating Vanessa's downfall, Sarah's body was preparing for its own crisis. The stress of the past weeks, the trauma of the assault, the revelation about her father, all of it was taking a toll. She was sitting in the hotel room reviewing documents about the foundation she wanted to start when the first contraction hit. It felt like a vice grip around her entire abdomen. She gasped, her hand going to her belly. Sarah? Frank was at her side immediately. What's wrong? I don't know. It felt like another contraction, stronger this time. Dad, something's wrong. Okay, stay calm. We're going to... Oh, her water broke. but it wasn't clear fluid. It was tinged with blood. Frank grabbed his phone. "We need an ambulance at the Ritz-Carlton Presidential Suite. My daughter's 8 months is pregnant, and she's going into premature labor. There's blood. We need it now." The next 20 minutes blurred together. EMTs arriving, strapping Sarah to a stretcher. The wail of sirens as they raced through Dallas traffic. Frank held his daughter's hand while monitors beeped frantically around them. "Blood pressure dropping," the EMT called out. "Possible placental abruption, just like before." "No," Sarah was crying. "Not now, please. Not now. Sick guy." "Stay with me, Sarah. Stay with me." They burst through the emergency room doors of Mercy General, the same hospital Frank now owned. Dr. Garcia was already waiting, having been alerted by Frank's team. "We need to do an emergency C-section now," she said, her voice urgent but controlled. "The baby's in distress." Grace Murphy appeared beside the stretcher. She'd been reinstated as head nurse the moment Frank bought the hospital. "OR is ready, doctor." They rushed Sarah through the doors. Frank tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir. You can't come in. We'll take care of her." The doors swung shut, leaving Frank alone in the hallway. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, Frank Mitchell, billionaire and titan of industry, felt completely helpless. All his money, all his power, all his carefully executed revenge, none of it mattered if his daughter and grandson didn't survive. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, head in his hands. "Please," he whispered to no one and everyone. "Not her, not the baby. Take everything else, but not them." In the operating room, alarms were sounding. The baby's heart rate was dropping. "We're losing him," Dr. Garcia said. "Get me." And then everything happened at once. 2 hours passed. To Frank, it felt like 2 years. He sat in the waiting room, still wearing the same clothes from the war room. His billion-dollar suit felt like a costume, meaningless in the face of what was happening behind those surgical doors. Harold Morrison sat beside him, silent. There was nothing to say, no words of comfort that would mean anything. Then the waiting room doors opened, and Marcus Hartford walked in. Frank was on his feet and immediately, every muscle tensed for a fight. "You have a lot of nerve." "I know," Marcus said quickly, "but I'm not here to fight." "Then why are you here?" "Because no matter what I've done, that's still my son in there." They stood facing each other in tense silence. Marcus looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his clothes hung loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I didn't know what Vanessa was planning," Marcus said. "I swear to God, I didn't know." "You cheated on my daughter while she was pregnant." Marcus flinched. "Yes, I'm weak. I've always been weak. Vanessa told me to do it, and I did it because I've never known how to stand up to her." He took a shaky breath. "But I'm here now to do one thing right, finally." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and held it out to Frank. Signed custody papers. "I'm giving up all parental rights." Frank stared at the envelope. "Wish on him." "Because Sarah deserves better, and so does my son. I can't be the father he needs, but she can be the mother, and you—" Marcus's voice broke. "You're the kind of man I wish I was." Frank took the papers slowly. Inside was everything Marcus had just promised. Full custody to Sarah. No visitation rights. No financial obligation beyond initial support. It was complete surrender. "This doesn't fix what you did," Frank said. "I know. Nothing can. But maybe it's enough to let her start over. Without me in the way." Before either could say more, the OR doors opened. Dr. Garcia emerged, pulling down her surgical mask. Both men froze. "Congratulations," she said, smiling. "Healthy baby boy. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Frank felt his legs nearly give out. "And Sarah?" "Exhausted, but she's asking for you." Frank rushed past her without a word. Marcus stayed behind, standing alone in the waiting room. He looked down at his hands that had signed away his son, and wondered if this was what growing up finally felt like. In the recovery room, Sarah held a tiny bundle wrapped in blue. She was pale and exhausted, with tubes still attached, but her eyes shone with fierce love as she looked down at the baby. "Dad," she said softly, "meet Benjamin. Benjamin Frank Mitchell." Frank approached slowly as if afraid this moment might shatter. He looked down at his grandson for the first time. The baby had Sarah's nose, her delicate features. His eyes were closed, one tiny fist pressed against his mouth. "Hey there, little guy," Frank's voice broke. "Your grandpa's here." "We made it," Sarah whispered. "You made it. You're stronger than all of us." They stayed like that for a long moment, the three generations of Mitchells together, until Sarah noticed the envelope in Frank's hand. "What's that?" "Custody papers. Marcus signed over all parental rights. He's giving you sole custody." Sarah looked down at Benjamin, thinking about what that meant. Her son would grow up without a father, but maybe that was better than growing up with the wrong one. "Okay," she said simply. 2 weeks later, the criminal court of New York was packed. Media filled the gallery, cameras outside captured every person entering. This had become the trial of the year, billionaire versus billionaire, with a pregnant woman caught in the middle. Judge Patricia Holland presided, a stern woman in her 60s known for being tough but fair. She'd heard a lot of cases in her 30 years on the bench, but this one was different. The evidence was so damning, the public interest so intense, that every decision would be scrutinized. "The people of New York versus Vanessa Hartford and Chelsea Price," she began, "on charges of aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice." Assistant District Attorney Monica Carter rose from the prosecution table. She was a slim woman in her 40s, known for her methodical preparation and devastating cross-examinations. "Your Honor, the people will prove that the defendants deliberately assaulted Sarah Mitchell Hartford while she was 7 months pregnant, causing severe injury and nearly killing her unborn child. We will further prove that the defendants then engaged in a conspiracy to cover up their crime, bribing hospital officials, threatening witnesses, and committing fraud." Richard Thorne, defending Vanessa, stood. "Your Honor, my clients maintain that this was a tragic accident. Emotions ran high, but there was no criminal intent." "Then let's see what the evidence says," Judge Holland replied. "Prosecution, call your first witness." The people called Grace Murphy. Grace took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was terrified, but she'd made her choice. Something that mattered more than job security. "Miss Murphy, can you describe what you witnessed on the afternoon of October 15th? Grace took a deep breath. "I was working the reception desk on the 4th floor. I heard shouting. When I looked up, I saw Mrs. Hartford, Sarah, near the wall. Miss Vanessa Hartford and Miss Chelsea Price were standing close to her. Then I saw Miss Hartford's foot connect with Mrs. Mitchell's wing. Sarah fell hard. Was there any attempt to help Mrs. Mitchell after she fell?" "No, her father arrived moments later and called 911. The two women walked away." Richard Thorne rose for cross-examination. "Miss Murphy, isn't it true that you were on administrative leave when you gave your statement? That you might have been motivated by anger at your employer?" "I was placed on leave because I witnessed a crime and they wanted me to stay quiet. I testified because it was the right thing to do." No further questions. The next piece of evidence changed everything. The prosecution displayed the security footage on screens throughout the courtroom. Enhanced, time-stamped, absolutely clear. Silent black and white video showed the hallway. Sarah standing near the restroom. Vanessa and Chelsea approaching. The confrontation, the shove, the kick. Sarah falling. Blood spreading across the floor. Several jurors gasped. One wiped tears from her eyes. "The defense claimed this was an accident," A.D. Carter said quietly. "Does that look like an accident to you?" Thomas Blake testified next, escorted by federal marshals. He'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Miss Hartford paid me $250,000 to pose as Sarah's attorney and trick her into signing a false affidavit. Do you have proof?" Blake provided wire transfers, emails, burner phone records. Everything. Dr. Porter testified with immunity. "Miss Hartford bribed me to delete the security footage and discredit Sarah Mitchell. I took $500,000. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway." Finally, Vanessa took the stand against her lawyer's advice. She'd refused to accept this defeat quietly. "Miss Hartford, did you assault Sarah Mitchell?" "She doesn't belong in my family," Vanessa said, her voice cold. "She's a nobody trying to steal our legacy." "That's not an answer. Did you kick her?" "I was protecting my brother." "By assaulting a pregnant woman?" Something in Vanessa finally broke. Tears began streaming down her face, and when she spoke again, Her voice shook. She looked just like her, like the woman who destroyed my mother. The courtroom went silent. My father loved someone else, a woman named Julia. She haunted our family for decades. And Sarah? Sarah has her eyes. Every time I looked at her, I saw Julia, and I couldn't. It was the worst thing she could have said. The jury looked horrified. Vanessa had just admitted her assault was premeditated, based on a decades-old grudge that had nothing to do with Sarah. Chelsea testified with a plea deal already in place. I'm guilty. I was paid to seduce Marcus and help destroy Sarah. I did it because I needed money for my mother's treatment. But watching her almost lose her baby, I can't live with that anymore. The closing arguments were brief. The evidence spoke for itself. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Vanessa Hartford, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, Vanessa Hartford, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Vanessa Hartford, guilty. Vanessa Hartford was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, a $2 million fine, and permanent ban from the securities industry. Chelsea Price received 3 years, reduced for cooperation. Dr. Porter got 5 years and lost his medical license. Thomas Blake received 4 years for fraud. As they led Vanessa away in handcuffs, she looked back at Marcus, who sat in the gallery. I did it for you, for us, for Father. Marcus met her eyes and said quietly, you did it for yourself. Goodbye, Vanessa. Frank watched from the back of the courtroom, Sarah beside him with baby Benjamin in her arms. Justice had been served. The law had worked. But as they left the courthouse, Frank knew the truth. The law had only worked because he'd had the power to make it work, because he'd used his wealth to protect the evidence, to hire the best lawyers, to ensure the truth couldn't be buried. And that realization sat heavy in his chest. Was this justice, or was it just one billionaire defeating another? He didn't have an answer. 6 months later, life had settled into something resembling normal. Though normal, for the Mitchell family, now meant something entirely different than it had a year ago. Sarah stood in her new apartment on the Upper East Side, looking out floor-to-ceiling windows at Central Park. The apartment was beautiful, spacious, nothing like the modest place she'd lived in during her marriage. Frank had insisted on buying it for her, and for once, they hadn't argued. Baby Benjamin, now 6 months old, played on a blanket nearby. He'd learned to sit up recently and spent most of his time grabbing at toys and making delighted noises when they squeaked. Sarah picked him up, settling into the rocking chair Frank had bought. It was handmade, expensive, but comfortable. Some of her father's choices still surprised her with their thoughtfulness. The television played quietly in the background. The news anchor's voice drifted through the room. Hartford Capital officially dissolved today. Assets will be liquidated to pay victims of the Ponzi scheme. Vanessa Hartford, currently serving 8 years at FCI Danbury, declined to comment. Do you think she's suffering? Sarah asked as Frank emerged from the kitchen with coffee. Does it matter? Sarah considered this. I guess not. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel. What did you think you'd feel? Happy? Satisfied? Like I won? Sarah looked down at Benjamin. But I don't feel any of that. I just feel tired and grateful he's here. Frank sat beside her, still wearing one of his flannel shirts despite now living in a penthouse of his own. Some habits were too deep to change. That's because you're not like them. You never were. But you are. A little. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, I am. Sarah had thought a lot about this over the past months, about what her father had done and what it meant. Did you go too far? Destroying Hartford Capital hurt innocent people too. Employees lost jobs. Clients lost money. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Yes, I did go too far, but if I had to do it again to protect you, I'd go even further. That scares me. Good, it should. Power without fear is how people like Vanessa happen. The doorbell rang, interrupting them. Grace Murphy stood in the hallway carrying a casserole and smiling. How's my favorite little guy? She'd become a regular visitor, having been promoted to head of nursing at what Frank had renamed Mitchell Memorial Hospital. He's perfect, learning new things every day. Grace set the casserole on the counter. Your dad did a good thing with the hospital, Sarah. New management tripled our nurses' salaries. People who'd been working 2 jobs can now focus on patient care. After Grace left, Sarah opened her laptop. She'd been working on something for weeks, a project that had started as a way to process her trauma and evolved into something bigger. The document on screen read, "The Benjamin Project, Mission Statement." Frank read over her shoulder. "You're starting a foundation? You taught me something, Dad. Money isn't evil, it's neutral. It's what you do with it that matters." What's the Benjamin Project? Legal and emotional support for pregnant women in crisis. Women who can't afford lawyers when they're abused. Women who don't have someone with power to protect them. Sarah looked up at him. "I had you. Most women don't. I want to be that for them." Frank felt something shift in his chest. Pride mixed with a bittersweet recognition that his daughter had taken the lessons of both her parents and made them her own. "You're going to be better than me. I'm going to try." There was another knock at the door. Frank opened it to find Marcus Hartford standing in the hallway. He looked different, thinner, older somehow, despite only being 33. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, nothing like the designer suits he'd favored during their marriage. "What are you doing here?" Frank asked, instantly protective. "I know I have no right, but I wanted to see if he's okay. Just once. Then I'll leave. Forever." Sarah appeared behind Frank, holding Benjamin. She looked at Marcus for a long moment, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the charming man who'd swept her off her feet, not the weak husband who'd betrayed her, but just a person who'd made terrible choices and was trying to live with them. "5 minutes," she said. Marcus approached slowly, his movements careful, non-threatening. He looked at his son, and tears filled his eyes. "He's beautiful. He looks like you. He has your chin." "I'm so sorry, Sarah, for everything. I know it doesn't." "You're right, it doesn't." Sarah's voice was firm but not cruel. "But thank you for the custody papers, for letting him go." "I didn't let him go. I set him free. From me." Marcus reached out as if to touch Benjamin's hand, then pulled back. "Be better than me, little guy. Be like your mom." He turned to leave, but Sarah stopped him. "Marcus," he paused, "I forgive you. Not for you, for me, so I can move on." Marcus's tears finally fell. "Thank you." After he left, Frank looked at his daughter with new respect. That took strength. Or weakness. I'm not sure which. Maybe they're the same thing sometimes. That night, Frank sat in Benjamin's nursery, rocking the sleeping baby gently. Sarah watched from the doorway, seeing her father in this quiet moment of tenderness. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "The apartment in Brooklyn, the firefighter story, was any of it real?" Frank was quiet for a long time. "The apartment's real. I bought it with my first million before you were born, and the firefighter part, that was real too. I was FDNY for 6 years in my 20s before business school. Best years of my life." "Why didn't you just tell me the truth? About the money?" "Because your mother made me promise when she was dying." Frank's mind drifted back to that hospital room 12 years ago. Rebecca, so thin and frail, holding teenage Sarah's hand. "Promise me," Rebecca had whispered. "Raise her normal, away from that world. I don't want her to become what we fought against." "But the money killed me. Doctors who didn't care because we were just another patient. If I'd gone to a public hospital, maybe someone would have fought harder." "You don't know that. Promise me. Let her live without it until she's strong enough to handle it." Back in the present, Frank looked at Benjamin. "So I kept my promise. I became Frank the firefighter, and you became everything your mother wanted you to be. Strong, compassionate, real. Do you regret it?" "Not for a second. But you're not those things. Strong, compassionate, real." Frank smiled sadly. "No, I'm the monster who protects you from other monsters." "You're not a monster, Dad. Ask Vanessa Hartford if she agrees." Sarah came and sat beside him. "What you did, was it revenge or justice?" "Honestly, I don't know anymore. Maybe there's no difference when someone hurts your child." Benjamin stirred in Frank's arms, making soft baby noises. Frank whispered to him, "Your mom's going to raise you better than I raised her." You won't have to choose between being kind and being strong. You'll be both. Later, after Sarah and Benjamin had gone to sleep, Frank stood at his penthouse window overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched out below him, millions of lights representing millions of lives. Somewhere out there, Vanessa Hartford sat in a prison cell. Chelsea Price was starting over at a women's shelter in Los Angeles. Marcus Hartford was teaching middle school in Portland, trying to become someone he could respect. And here was Frank Mitchell, back in the world of wealth and power he tried to leave behind. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had Sarah and Benjamin. And maybe, just maybe, they would help him remember how to be something more than just a man with money. His phone buzzed. A text from Harold Morrison. Benjamin Project filing approved. Foundation is official. Congratulations. Frank smiled. Sarah would be happy. She was taking everything they'd been through and transforming it into something that could help others. That was real strength. That was real power. And that, Frank thought, was worth more than all the billions in his accounts. 3 months later, the Benjamin Project opened its doors in a renovated building in downtown Manhattan. Sarah had thrown herself into the work, channeling her experience into something that could help others. The foundation offered free legal services, therapy, safe housing assistance, and financial support for pregnant women facing abuse or crisis. The opening ceremony was small, intimate. Sarah didn't want media coverage or society pages. She wanted the women who would actually use these services to feel safe coming through the doors. Grace Murphy had helped recruit nurses and counselors. Detective Reeves sat on the advisory board, using her experience to help train staff on working with police when women wanted to press charges. Even Harold Morrison volunteered his time, overseeing the legal department to ensure every woman who walked through those doors got representation that matched what the wealthy could afford. Frank attended the opening, standing in the back and watching his daughter cut the ribbon. She dressed simply, nothing flashy, and gave a speech that focused on the women they would help rather than her own story. No woman should face crisis alone, Sarah said. No woman should be afraid to seek help because she can't afford a lawyer. No woman should lose her baby because someone with money thinks they're above the law. The Benjamin Project exists to make sure that doesn't happen. The small crowd applauded. Among them were several women who'd already reached out for help, their faces hopeful in ways they probably hadn't felt in years. After the ceremony, Sarah found Frank in the hallway looking at photos they'd hung on the walls. Pictures of Sarah with Benjamin. Sarah volunteering at the hospital before everything changed. Sarah graduating from nursing school. Frank beside her in his firefighter's uniform. Thank you, Sarah said. For what? For funding this. For making it possible. Frank shook his head. You made it possible. I just provided resources. The idea, the heart, that's all you. I couldn't have done it without you. Maybe not, but I couldn't have done any of this without you either. You remind me why this money matters. Not for what it can buy, but for what it can protect, what it can build. They stood together in comfortable silence until Benjamin started fussing. Sarah picked him up from his carrier, and immediately his cries quieted. At 9 months old, he was starting to show personality. Curious, determined, gentle. A perfect combination of his mother's compassion and his grandfather's stubbornness. He's growing so fast, Frank said. I know, sometimes I look at him and can't believe he's mine, that he's here and healthy after everything. He's here because you fought for him. We fought for him, Sarah corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. Over the following weeks, the Benjamin Project began to make a real difference. Women came seeking help, and they received it. No judgment, no barriers, just support from people who understood what they were going through. One afternoon, Sarah met with a young woman named Jennifer who'd been referred by Detective Reeves. She was 6 months pregnant, her face bearing fading bruises, her hands trembling as she filled out intake forms. I don't have money for a lawyer, Jennifer said quietly. You don't need money. That's why we're here. My boyfriend, he said no lawyer would take my case, that nobody would believe me over him. Sarah sat down across from her. Your boyfriend was wrong. We believe you, and we're going to help you. Over the next hour, Sarah listened to Jennifer's story. It was horrifyingly similar to her own. A man who seemed charming at first, but became controlling. isolation from friends and family, escalating abuse that got worse during pregnancy, a moment of violence that nearly ended everything. But unlike Sarah, Jennifer didn't have a billionaire father. She didn't have private security or elite lawyers or the resources to fight back. Until now. We're going to assign you an attorney, Sarah explained. She's very good and she doesn't lose. We're also going to help you find safe housing and file for a restraining order. If you want to press charges, we'll support that too. Jennifer started crying. Why are you doing this? Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. Because someone should have done it for me before things got as bad as they did. Because every woman deserves protection. Because your baby deserves to be born safe. After Jennifer left with an appointment scheduled and a lawyer assigned, Sarah sat in her office and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her trauma had purpose, that something good was coming from something terrible. Frank found her like that, wiping tears from her face and smiling simultaneously. You okay? Yeah, this is working, Dad. We're actually helping people. I never doubted you would. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from Marcus. The subject line read, "Thank you." Sarah almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity made her click. Sarah, I know I have no right to contact you, but I wanted you to know that I'm teaching now, middle school English in Portland. I tell my students about mistakes and consequences in becoming better people. I don't use our story specifically, but it informs everything I say. I also wanted you to know that I saw the news about the Benjamin Project. What you're doing is incredible. You're helping people who need it, and you're doing it with grace and compassion that I never had. Benjamin is lucky to have you as his mother. I send him a birthday card every year, even though I know you don't respond. I don't expect you to, but I want him to know when he's older that I thought about him, that I cared, even if I didn't deserve to. I hope you're happy, Sarah. Really happy. You deserve it. Marcus. Sarah read the email twice, then closed her laptop. She wouldn't respond, but she also wouldn't delete it. Someday when Benjamin was old enough to ask about his father, she would show him this email. She would let him see that Marcus had tried, in his own limited way, to do better. That night, Sarah found Frank in the nursery again. He made a habit of putting Benjamin to bed, rocking him gently while humming old songs. Do you think Benjamin will understand? Sarah asked. When he's older and learns about everything that happened, I think he'll understand that his mother fought for him, that his grandfather protected him, that people made mistakes, but other people tried to make things right. What if he asks about Marcus? Then you tell him the truth. His father loved him, but wasn't strong enough to be the father he needed. That's not Benjamin's fault, and it's not yours. It's just the truth. Sarah sat down in the second rocking chair. Do you think we're okay now, as a family? Frank looked at her seriously. I think we're better than okay. We're honest. We know who we are, the good and the bad. We're not pretending anymore. I like that. Me too. Benjamin yawned, his tiny mouth opening wide, and both Sarah and Frank laughed at the absurd cuteness of it. He's going to be something special, Frank said. He already is. As they sat together in the quiet nursery, the city glowing beyond the windows, Sarah realized something profound. The assault, the trial, the revelation about her father, all of it had been terrible, traumatic, life-altering in ways she was still processing. But it had also stripped away pretense. It had forced her to face truth about herself, about her father, about the world. And from those hard truths, she was building something real. The Benjamin Project would help hundreds, maybe thousands of women over the years. It would change lives, save lives. And that mattered more than revenge, more than money, more than anything. Dad, Sarah said quietly. Yeah? I'm glad I know the truth now, about who you are, about everything. Frank met her eyes. Me too, baby girl. Me too. 1 year after the assault, Sarah stood in Central Park pushing Benjamin's stroller. Fall had arrived in New York, painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Benjamin babbled happily from his stroller, pointing at leaves and bakes and pigeons with equal enthusiasm. At 15 months old, he was walking, talking in simple words, and developing the stubborn independence that reminded Sarah so much of her father. Her phone buzzed, a text from the Benjamin Project. Another success story. Jennifer got full custody and her ex took a plea deal. She starts her new job next week. Thank you for everything. Sarah smiled. Jennifer was one of dozens of women they'd helped over the past year. Each success felt personal, a small redemption for what Sarah had endured. She found an empty bench and sat, letting Benjamin toddle around nearby under her watchful eye. A jogger passed, then a couple walking hand in hand, then an elderly man with a newspaper. Life continuing in its ordinary way. Sarah's mind drifted to everything that had changed. Vanessa Hartford was serving her sentence in federal prison. From what Frank's lawyers reported, she kept to herself, didn't cause trouble, but also showed no remorse. Some people, Sarah had learned, never truly understood the harm they caused. Chelsea Price had completed her sentence and was now working at a women's shelter in Los Angeles. She'd reached out once through social media, a simple message that said, "I'm sorry, I hope you and your son are well." Sarah had responded with a single word, "Thanks." It wasn't friendship, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough. Marcus sent birthday cards to Benjamin like clockwork. Sarah kept them in a box, unopened. When Benjamin was old enough to ask about his father, she would let him decide whether to read them. That would be his choice, not hers. Dr. Porter had been released early for good behavior and was working as a medical consultant, barred from ever practicing medicine again. Justice, Sarah had learned, wasn't always permanent imprisonment. Sometimes it was permanent consequence. Frank approached across the grass, carrying coffee from the cart near the entrance. He'd developed a routine of meeting Sarah and Benjamin at the park on Saturday mornings. He still wore flannel shirts more often than suits, still lived modestly despite his wealth, still carried himself like a man more comfortable fighting fires than hosting charity galas. "How's my grandson?" Frank asked, settling on the bench beside Sarah. "Perfect, as always." Benjamin waved enthusiastically at Frank, shouting "Papa" with delight. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Benjamin explore the safe circle around the bench. After a while, Sarah spoke. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately." Frank turned to her. "Yeah? Do you think she'd be proud of what we became, what we did?" Frank considered this carefully. "I think she'd be proud of you. The foundation, the way you turned trauma into purpose. That's exactly what she would have wanted. And you? I don't know. I broke the promise I made her. I went back to that world, used that money and power. I became the thing she wanted to protect you from." Sarah shook her head. "No, Dad. You became the thing that protected me. There's a difference. Mom wanted me safe and strong and compassionate. I am those things because of both of you. You didn't break your promise. You kept it in a different way." Frank's eyes grew wet. "Thank you for that." Benjamin toddled over, demanding to be picked up. Sarah lifted him, and he immediately reached for Frank, who took him with practiced ease. "Papa," Benjamin said seriously, as if about to share great wisdom. Then he just laughed and grabbed Frank's nose. They stayed at the park for another hour, soaking in the autumn sunshine and the simple pleasure of being together. No drama, no crisis, no billionaires plotting revenge. Just a family. As they walked back toward Frank's car, Sarah's phone rang. The Benjamin Project director. "Sarah, we just got a call from someone who wants to make a major donation. They said they saw the impact report and want to fund expansion to 3 more cities." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. "That's incredible. Who's the donor?" "They want to remain anonymous, but they specified the funds should go toward legal services for women who can't afford representation." After hanging up, Sarah looked at Frank suspiciously. "Was that you?" "What? The anonymous donor?" Frank smiled innocently. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Though if I were going to make an anonymous donation, I'd probably do it through a shell corporation to maintain privacy. And I'd probably structure it to maximize tax benefits while ensuring the maximum amount goes directly to services rather than administration." "Dad, I'm just saying hypothetically." Sarah laughed and linked her arm through his. "Thank you, hypothetically." That evening, Sarah put Benjamin to bed in the nursery that had become her favorite room in the apartment. Soft lighting, gentle colors, walls decorated with hand-painted clouds that Frank had commissioned from a local artist. As she rocked Benjamin to sleep, She sang the same lullaby her mother used to sing to her. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. Benjamin's eyes grew heavy, his breathing deepened, and soon he was asleep. Sarah sat there a while longer, just watching him breathe. This tiny person who had been through so much before he was even born. This miracle who had survived against odds that still sometimes kept her awake at night. You're going to be strong, she whispered, like your grandpa, and kind, like your grandma, and brave enough to be both at the same time. Frank appeared in the doorway, having let himself in with the key Sarah had given him. She'd told him he could come and go as he pleased. After everything, she wanted him close. Is he asleep? Finally, he fought it tonight. He gets that from you. They walked to the living room together. Frank had brought takeout from Sarah's favorite Thai place, and they ate sitting on the floor with paper plates balanced on their knees, like they used to do in Brooklyn before everything changed. I got something in the mail today, Frank said, pulling out an envelope. Invitation to a charity gala for pediatric cancer research. Sarah made a face. You're not seriously thinking about going? Actually, I was thinking we should go. Together. Dad, I hate those things. All those rich people pretending to care while really just networking. I know, but the Benjamin Project could benefit from networking. These are the people who write the big checks. If we want to expand, we need their money. Sarah sighed. He was right, of course. Fine, but I'm not wearing anything uncomfortable. Deal. And Sarah, we'll do it our way. No pretense, no playing games, just honest about who we are and what we're building. When did you get so wise? Around the time my daughter taught me that strength and compassion aren't opposites. A week later, they attended the gala. Sarah wore a simple but elegant dress, nothing too flashy. Frank wore a suit but paired it with a tie Sarah had given him that had tiny fire trucks on it, a small rebellion against the formality. They mingled, talked about the Benjamin Project, met potential donors, and something remarkable happened. People responded to their authenticity, to the fact that Sarah talked about her trauma openly, without shame, to the fact that Frank didn't try to network or play power games. By the end of the night, they had commitments for over $2 million in additional funding. I hate to admit it, Sarah said in the car going home, but that was actually kind of fun. Don't tell anyone, Frank replied. We have a reputation as antisocial hermits to maintain. They laughed together, and in that moment, Sarah realized something. She was happy, truly, genuinely happy. Not the naive happiness of before, when she'd thought love and good intentions were enough, but a deeper happiness earned through pain and built on truth. She had her son, she had her father. She had work that mattered. She had learned hard lessons about power and justice and the complicated ways they intertwined. And she had peace, not the peace of ignorance, but the peace of having fought and survived and chosen to build something good from the ruins. That night, after saying goodnight to Frank and putting Benjamin down for the third time, he was going through a phase of needing multiple tuck-ins. Sarah sat at her laptop. She opened a new document and began to write. To my son, Benjamin, to read when you were older. You were born from crisis, carried through trauma, nearly lost before you took your first breath. And yet here you are, healthy and happy and perfect. Your first year taught me something important. That from terrible things, beautiful things can grow. That survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Your grandfather showed me that protecting the ones you love sometimes means becoming something you swore you'd never be. And that's okay. We're all more complicated than we think. Your father made mistakes, terrible ones, but he's trying to be better. Someday, when you're ready, you can decide if you want to know him. That's your choice, and I'll support whatever you decide. Your grandmother, who you never got to meet, believed in raising people with compassion and strength. I'm trying to do that with you, to show you that being kind isn't weakness, and being strong doesn't mean being cruel. The world is complicated, Benjamin. It's not fair. Money matters, even though it shouldn't. Power protects people, even bad people. Justice is something you have to fight for, and sometimes fighting for it changes you. But here's what I know for sure. Love matters most. The love that protects, the love that builds, the love that turns pain into purpose. You are so loved, my sweet boy. By me, by your grandfather, by everyone at the Benjamin Project who fights every day to make sure other children get to grow up safe like you. That love, that fierce, protective, transformative love, that's what changed everything. That's what made all of this worth it. So grow up strong, grow up kind, grow up knowing that you can be both. And if you ever face impossible choices, remember, the hardest path is often the right one. I love you forever, Mom. Sarah saved the document and closed her laptop. Someday Benjamin would read that and understand. Until then, she would keep fighting, keep building, keep transforming her trauma into something that helped others. She walked to Benjamin's room one last time, just to check. He was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered with endless lights, each one a person, a story, a life continuing despite everything. Sarah thought about Vanessa sitting in her prison cell, about Marcus teaching students in Portland, about Chelsea helping women at the shelter, about all the women who walked through the Benjamin Project's doors seeking help. Everyone was trying in their own way to be better, to do better. That had to count for something. Sarah kissed her fingers and pressed them gently to Benjamin's forehead. Sweet dreams, baby boy. Tomorrow will change the world again. Just a little bit. And in that quiet moment, in that peaceful nursery overlooking the city that had witnessed both her greatest trauma and her greatest triumph, Sarah Mitchell understood something profound. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration, about taking what was broken and making it whole again, about using pain as fuel to prevent others from suffering the same way. Her father had taught her that power could protect. Her mother had taught her that compassion could strengthen. And Benjamin, without saying a word, had taught her that some things were worth any price, any sacrifice, any fight. She was a survivor, a mother, a founder, a fighter. And she was finally, blessedly, beautifully at peace.